The Gospel of John gives its own particular take on this great mystery of the resurrection. Let's take a look at it. First of all, there are three persons that we're listening to in this. There is Simon Peter, there is Mary Magdalene, the good friend of Jesus, perhaps the first evangelizer, and then there is the beloved disciple who remains nameless. They all come to the tomb. Mary Magdalene was the first person to go in and realize that there was something amiss. The stone was rolled back, and inside were the burial cloths very close, very carefully folded together, apart. Now, this is significant because a few weeks ago, when we saw that great miracle of Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead, Lazarus came out with the burial cloths, and Jesus ordered that to be untied so he would be set free. But not today. The burial cloths were neatly wrapped together. Now, what's the significance of that? One is, they're saying, is that the body couldn't have been stolen because if somebody had come in and taken the body away, the burial cloths would have been there too, because they would not be unwrapping the burial cloths and very carefully folding it to the side. There's a difference between resuscitation, which took place with Lazarus, he was eventually to die, and resurrection. Because resurrection meant that Jesus was now glorified. He was present in a much different way than the apostles experienced him when they traveled with him during his 3 years of public ministry. Now, in this particular reading, it begins simply saying, the beloved disciple saw and believed. But it says nothing about Peter nor about Mary Magdalene. However, if we keep on reading beyond what was read from today's readings, continuing John's gospel, he first makes a statement that disciples walked away. Incredulous, wondering why the empty tomb, still not understanding the mystery of the resurrection. And that was the case even with Mary Magdalene. But she stayed. She didn't walk away. She was out in the garden, and we hear later on is that Jesus appeared to her. But again, she didn't recognize him. She thought he was the gardener. It was only when Jesus said those personal words, Mary, that her eyes opened and she said, Rabboni. But then Jesus said, don't touch me yet because I have not ascended to my Father. So that's Mary Magdalene. Peter was the impetuous one who couldn't run as fast as the beloved disciple. He saw, but that was it. He went back. Now that takes us to the beloved disciple. There is no name mentioned. The noted scholar Raymond Brown, in commenting on this, he writes a whole book on the Church of the Beloved Disciple. He says the beloved disciple really represents all of those who never experienced Jesus personally, never knew him, but believed. Remember the words in today's gospel, he saw and believed. Believed what? At the time, maybe he believed there was an empty grave. Later on, the belief would be that Jesus is very much alive and with his people. He is present in a much more profound way than he'd ever been present before. So that brings us to the experience that we heard in the gospel of the empty grave and the burial cloths neatly folded to the side. Margaret Rinkel, in her memoirs, describes an experience that she had. It was March, and she was tending to her garden, and all of a sudden, she was starting to weed the rosemary, then looked, and inside that was a rabbit's nest. And she realized that in there were these tiny little rabbits, maybe just the size of a thumb, totally helpless. Their eyes were even closed. The mother rabbit had done was created a nest beneath the rosemary and carefully placed her offspring in this nest. So Margaret decided, I'm not going to touch that. I'm just going to leave it. And so she went away. And then a few months later, she returned. And when she returned, starting to rake out the rosemary, there was that nest, and it was empty. But then one thing that she did notice was that there were the traces in that nest of the rabbit fur. It was a reminder to her of what it was before, that those tiny little rabbits were nestled protective because the smell of the rosemary kept other animals from coming and destroying them. But it came the time in which they could go forth from that nest free and live on. Well, the empty tomb, in a sense, is a reminder of that. We have the traces of Christ there. But we know that he is not in that tomb, that he is very much alive. I think right now, during this time of the pandemic, we might see ourselves like those little rabbits, encased in our own homes, confined, locked up. But there comes a time when we will be able to go forth. So let that Easter be our theme, because it is what gives us hope. In the second reading, Paul's letter to the Colossians, he says, don't look on the earth, what is below, but rather focus on what is above. Focus on our destiny. Focus on the life that Jesus had offered us, because he died and rose from the dead. And this is what gives us hope, even in the darkest moments. You know, at the time that John wrote that gospel, the disciples of Jesus, we're talking about maybe 60 years after the death of Jesus. The disciples of Jesus were in crisis. They were seeing their leaders martyred. It was a time of gloom. But the message of John was life and hope. The risen Christ is present, is alive, and will lead all of you out of that period of darkness. What was true then is true today. Let's allow the risen Christ, in all that it means, to lead us, give us hope, and realize that he is the God of life, not of death, and that Calvary led to Easter. Let us rejoice in that. Let us maintain our hope, so that those words we chanted before the gospel, Alleluia, will really be sincere, because indeed the Lord is risen and is alive.